My name's Arn Franz, and I'm the Director of Parks and Open Space for the city and the project manager for the Conway Park project. So for the record, I wanted to say thank you everyone for coming to the meeting and for your concerns about Conway Park. We share them and want to work with you as much as possible. For the record, excuse me, this is Wednesday, December 5th, and this is a public information session regarding the contamination at Conway Park. And we are at the Public Safety Building at 220 Washington Street, Union Square. And the purpose of the meeting is to provide a community update on the work at Conway Park and to discuss the most recent testing and the next steps and to answer your questions about the project. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Alderman Scott here, who has been active in the project as well. Our last meeting on this, our last community meeting on this project was in March, I think March 29th, shortly after we discovered the contaminants at Conway Park and we closed the field. Since then, we've been doing a significant amount of testing to figure out what the contaminants are, the level of contaminants or locations, and we'll have our consultants talk about that in just a minute. But before we introduce the Weston Sampson team, I just wanted to cover a couple of things. People have asked about, how can they ask questions about the park or the project or the status, and there are some very easy things to do. One, we've got a sign-in sheet in the back, so if you haven't signed in, please do sign in and write your email down very clearly so we have that information so we can put you on our email list. Second, we've got some yellow paper in the back. Louise is holding it up right now. If you have questions about the park, feel free to write them down there. Louisa can pass out paper and pens to anybody who needs them, and we can ask those questions at the end, and we'll have them written down, and we can incorporate them into our website comments later. We'll do our presentation, and then after the presentation, we'll follow up with questions and answers. So if you could hold your questions until then, I'd appreciate it. And lastly, going back, we do have the city website up, which has information on Conway Park, and there's a menu item there where you can pull down and put your name on our email list there as well. So please feel free to do that. On the website, you could also access the most recent information on the park, and we've got a list of FAQs, frequently asked questions about the park. There's a long list there, so if you have questions about the process or where we are, please refer to that as well. We'll take the questions from tonight's meeting and incorporate that into the website and add to those FAQs as necessary. When we had the last meeting in March, we recorded that presentation as we are with tonight's, and that is on the website, and this presentation will be on the website as well. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our team from Weston Sampson. We've got 2 LSPs and a senior risk assessor, and toxologist, and we'll have the presentation from George Naslis. George, thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Arn. Thank you, everyone. So first off, little logistics. We try to sync these up, but we weren't quite successful. So they're the same presentation. So just bear with us as we try and advance the slides at the same time. I'm George Naslis. I'm a licensed site professional with Weston and Sampson Engineers. I have my colleagues Prasanta Bunya and Marie Ruderman with me. I'd also like to recognize Steve Johnson and Eric Johnson, who are both from Mass DEP, and they'll be available also at the end to answer questions if appropriate. Quick show of hands, was anyone here at the March meeting? Okay, great. So today, a few opening remarks. We're going to talk a little bit about the site history and how we got here. We're going to discuss the assessment process and the regulatory overview for this project. And then we'll get into some of the data that we've discovered thus far, and then talk a little bit about next steps. And as Arn said, we'd love it if you could just hold questions to the end, and then we'll answer questions in the public format. and we'll stick around as well at the end if there are additional questions. So, as I mentioned, we're going to discuss this. Today's meeting is really to provide an update on the environmental conditions. We're going to focus primarily on the data collected since March. We've collected a lot of data through the summer, and I already introduced the city representatives, Arn's here, and Weston Sampson and Mass DEP. Let's talk a little bit about the project. How did we get here in the first place? It really started last fall, October, November, with the desire to fix a retaining wall issue in the southeast corner of the park. As part of that assessment, we did a geotechnical assessment and a structural assessment, but we also did some environmental testing, primarily to evaluate the quality of the soil that would need to be displaced and managed as part of the wall project, but also a little bit of looking ahead. Given that we knew the park was going to be renovated, we wanted to understand what types of contaminants we might encounter. What we found was elevated lead and polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which we detected in one sample. So that prompted a discussion about the lead. It was not unusual to find lead in historic fill at the site, but the PCBs raised a question, and then we went back in March, did additional sampling, and lo and behold, we found higher concentrations across the park. And at that point, we decided it was very important that the park be shut down, access restricted, so we could work out what the concentrations were, where they were, distribution, and next steps. The concentrations did trigger reportable concentration, so DEP was notified, formally notified in March, and on March 29th, and which actually was the same day we had our first public meeting to let folks know what was going on. A little bit about the site history. The site was a bleachery and dye works dating back to the 1800s, and it operated as that until the early 30s. We're not quite sure the date of shutdown, but it was somewhere around 1934. We found some correspondence discussing the need for fields in the 40s. I'm not quite sure when they were, when any fields were constructed, but it looks like there were some field complex was there in the 50s, and it was renovated in 1976, and then again in 2001. So let's talk about the assessment process. This site is duly regulated. It makes it a little more complicated than some of the normal sites. The site's regulated by Mass DEP. That's under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, also known as the MCP, Mass Contingency Plan. These kinds of sites require oversight by a licensed site professional, and they come under LSP oversight, so that's one of the reasons Weston and Sampson's involved. I'm an LSP, Prasanta's an LSP, and we plan out the assessment phases, we evaluate the data, we make sure submittals are submitted in a timely manner, and we move forward through the Mass Contingency Plan cleanup process, which I'll touch on in a minute. Because of the presence of PCBs, the site is also regulated by EPA. That puts us in a separate and parallel regulatory pathway under the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, that regulates PCB sites. And that working with EPA requires their approval as we move through the cleanup. So it's a very important thing to understand that as we move forward, everything we've done thus far has been in collaboration and in discussion with both DEP and EPA, and we'll continue to do that as we move forward to cleanup. So timeline, it's not the greatest graphic, but what we want to show here is a typical MCP timeline. Basically on the left you have year one. Year one is where you do your preliminary assessment. From notification you have 1 year to get your arms around what we're dealing with on any site. This is not specific to Conway. This is for any particular site. So the level of effort typically on an initial assessment is usually a couple of wells, 4 wells, maybe 5 wells, depending on the size of the site, some soil sampling, and an initial understanding of what we have. So after a year, we can do what's called a tier classification, which is really looking at the site data and kind of like a pass-fail test of whether this is a serious site and requires ongoing DEP involvement, or if it can be handled exclusively by a licensed site professional. From after tier classification, we have 5 years to get to cleanup. So first 3 years are really doing that detailed site assessment to get our arms around nature and extent of contamination. So this is important because I want everyone to understand under a normal MCP process, it's a phased approach, it's an iterative approach, and it takes time. It takes time to plan out the assessment, to get the data, to evaluate the data, and then move to the next steps. After 3 years after notification, we provide a document that summarizes the nature and extent of contamination and the plan for remediation. And then there are 2 more years to get to cleanup. What's important is what we've done at Conway. We've done a lot. We had the initial data back in late November, December of 2017. We identified then that there was what's called a 120-day reportable condition. We had basically 4 months to notify. This was based on that initial data set, which was very limited. But at the time, we recognized that we needed to get more data. Spoke to Marie Prasansa, we looked at the data, and we came up with a plan to understand this a little more in that window that we had to see if there was a bigger problem. So we collected data in March, and in March we found out that indeed we had PCBs at the site more widespread than we anticipated. So at that point, we made a recommendation to the city. The city closed down the park and the playground. And when we say park, we kind of are talking about both the playground area and the ball field. City closed it down, and then also coincided with the formal notification to DEP. We had spoken with DEP and EPA verbally about what we have found, but the formal notification went in on March 29th. That's an important day because that's when the mass contingency plan timeline begins. So from there, we basically have a year to do that initial site assessment that I talked about. So in that time, we met on site with Mass DEP and EPA. We reviewed what we knew at the time. We looked at the site conditions. We looked at possible exposure, and we came up with a fairly robust sampling plan to evaluate the remainder of the playground specifically and also the ball field area. We conducted those investigations through the summer, and we were getting data in towards the end of the summer, early fall. We looked at the data, and we did a couple of things. First thing was to focus on the playground and with a view to getting the playground open. Could we do that safely? Do we have enough information? So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then secondly, we looked at the data for the ball field. Now, during this time, everything was closed to the public. Most people know that, but the reason was we needed to understand what we had before we felt we could start to making recommendations about whether or not we open areas of the park. As I mentioned, we talk about the playground and the ball field, and when we talk about the playground, I'm going to talk about the northwest portion. That's this area where the sliders and the features are on the mulched area. And then there's a southeastern portion, which is where the concrete pad is and the grassy area. And we do look at them separately because there's different exposure and different data actually from those two areas. And then the ball field, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I'll move forward with what we did. So our fieldwork summary, we looked at we took a lot of samples. We sampled at approximately 110 sampling locations between the initial test pits and some borings, additional soil borings that we did throughout the parcel. We collected over 700 samples. That's a lot. we collected them at different depths, starting with superficial soil, 0 to 0.5 feet below grade, and then at 1 foot increments, and then as we got a little deeper, we went to 2 foot increments. We put in groundwater wells. We felt that based on the contaminants that we knew about, it was unlikely that we would see impacts in groundwater, but we wanted to test the groundwater anyway to see if there's evidence of any large release, and the good news is we did not find contaminants in groundwater. We also collected some concrete samples. For those of you who know the playground area, there's an area where there's concrete paths that come out from the ball field, and there was concern that if there was dirt brought onto the concrete, could that be an exposure? So we collected some concrete samples as well, and those were all non-detect too. We didn't detect anything in those. This plan just kind of gives you an idea, and there's a hard copy there on the board. This is just a plan of the site, but you can see we took a lot of, we collected a lot of data. We did a grid pattern across the ball field. It's a big area. We focused in where there was likely to be more exposure, specifically in the 2 baseball diamonds. And then we did a more detailed assessment as well in the playground area. This is just a cross-section through the area. It really kind of shows what we suspected that we had. We've got a thickness of urban fill or historic fill that was brought to this site initially probably some time after the bleachery closed in the 30s and 40s, as the site was filled and grade was built up. What we do see is in the northwest corner rather, the fill seems to get shallower, and we get into what we call native material at a shallower depth. And probably the greatest thickness is in the rear of the site towards the where the railroad is. So this graphic really talks just about the playground area. We spent a lot of time looking at the playground. There are different finishes. You've got mulch, up to 1 foot of mulch over a geotech style fabric, and then below that is the dirt. You've got concrete paths, you've got grass. So we analyzed all the different areas, and we had an initial analysis, then we went back and did a more focused analysis. We sampled the 0 to 0.5 feet depth, the superficial depth, and went down and collected deeper samples. So then the question was, you know, is the playground safe for, can we reopen it? Is it safe to play in? We collected quite a lot of data. We looked at it with Marie. We shared the data with DEP and EPA, and we concluded that the northwestern corner, so if you can picture this as Somerville Ave on the right side, the top end of this graphic is the area that we talked about with the swings, with the slides and the mulched area. We concluded that that area was, there really wasn't much contamination there. PCB concentrations were very low. They were either non-detect or well below the standard of 1. The lead concentrations were relatively low. We did have one hit that came in around the standard, but overall they were pretty low, and even that hit was below the geotech cell. It was in an area that's really no exposure. So we felt very confident that we should be recommending and could recommend that the northwestern portion could be reopened. So we had a lot of discussions with the city and with DEP and EPA, and we've made that recommendation, and the city's moved forward with reopening that portion. In order to be protective, though, of human health and the environment, we had some low concentrations detected in the grassy area. Now, given that we are also dealing with the ball field, we decided collectively that that area should remain closed and will be addressed down the road. So this is what I just said. We recommend reopening the northwest portion and keeping the southeast portion of the playground only closed till the future. The ball field. So the ball field's a big area. I think back in March, we had a limited data set from the ball field. So the bulk of those 700 samples actually came from the ball field area. As you saw, there's lots of dots on the plan there. We basically did a depth integrated profile, as I mentioned. We found that in general, the PCB, actually that's not quite right, the PCB concentrations in the surface are generally lower concentrations. As you go deep, they decrease with depth, but there is an area between 3 feet, 2 to 3 feet, and 7 and 8 feet in one area where we have higher concentrations, and I'll show those in a minute. The highest concentration that we detected at one location was actually greater than 7.5 feet below grade, but very high concentrations of 40,000 parts per million. And that's important because what I'm going to show you are a bunch of figures that show the distribution. And again, I want everyone to think that or understand that the reason we look at the superficial data, why that's important, is because that's what we could be, in theory, in contact with. But it's very important to understand what we're dealing with throughout the whole field, because we have to get to cleanup. We need to understand nature and extent. We also need to understand, is there something going on at this site where one area might be clean and one isn't, because that's how we plan for cleanup. So I'm going to run through a couple of figures that basically show concentrations at shallow depth and as we move down through the profile. The color-coded, anything that's white or blank is good, none detects. The blue is okay. Blue's relatively low concentrations, less than 5. Yellow's 5 to 10, and then orange is greater than 10, and you'll see some reds, and reds are above 50. 50 is a regulatory cutoff, or one of the regulatory markers that EPA will look at. So that's that's why we picked these ranges. So this is superficial, 0 to 0.5 feet. We, as you see, the northwestern corner of the playground looks good. This is PCBs only now. We looked at lead concentrations, but the lead concentrations we felt were much lower, and we discussed the risk. We didn't feel they were as much an issue as the PCBs. PCBs are really what's driving the risk at the site. And as you can see, we have kind of across the whole ball field, we have this variation. As we go down, this is the layer below it, 1 foot below it. You can see that we're starting to see in that southwestern corner an area of some concentrations of PCBs. We actually have our first red. And then the other areas, as we go deeper, seem to be a little cleaner. This interval shows the highest area of high concentrations, from 3.5 to 5.5 feet below grade. Again, seem to be focused in that southwestern corner. And this is where we're starting to see some pretty high numbers. So the question is something different going on in that area? And then this next one is where we have the highest concentration, that red bullseye. But as you can see, everything around it seems to be low concentrations. This is the 5.5 to 7.5 feet below grade. Sorry, that was actually 7.5 to 9.5 feet below grade, and this is 9.5 to 11.5 below grade. And when we get down to these depths, you can see we really don't have much residual PCBs, and we actually have some data a little deeper as well that shows non-detect. So what do we conclude from this? I'll come back to that in a second. What we concluded, as I mentioned, that we seem to think that the superficial soils, while there are some PCBs, are not as high concentrations as what we see as we moved down through the profile, with higher concentrations in that southwest corner. And we're really trying to think about, is something, as I mentioned earlier, something different going on in that corner? Is there perhaps some buried material there that would give us such high numbers when we don't see anything approaching that in other areas of the site? So our next steps, that's the data summary of where we're at. This is what we're going to be doing next. We just received approval from the city to think through the next steps and start moving forward. We're going to focus a little bit on that southwest corner. We're going to do a geophysical evaluation. We're going to do electromag and GPR survey. That's using a tool that basically looks for metal objects. We want to see, is anything buried there that would show up on a geophysical analysis. And it's a good tool because it means we're not digging things up at this point. We basically are bouncing radar waves or electromag waves through the earth and seeing what we pick up in the instruments. And it's quite a commonly used industry tool looking for specifically metal objects, buried metal objects. But it's important we understand why the concentrations in that area were so high. And if we indeed find something, then that will play into the remediation plan. Then the next phase, this is really what we're going to be doing the next few months. It's the remedial planning and conceptual design. We need to look at the data. We've looked at the data that we have. We need to now start to think ahead about how do we clean this site up, okay? What do we need to do that's protective of human health and the environment? What do we have to do per the regs? So that would be discussions with EPA and DEP a little bit. But how does this tie to a field design, right? Now, this is not a field design meeting, but we don't want to go ahead and design a cleanup that doesn't accommodate what the city wants from a field. The two really need to go hand in hand. We'll also need approvals from EPA and DEP along the way. And the fourth very important piece of this, we can't just design a cleanup in a field and say, okay, this is it, absent the city being involved in that process. So the plan is to come up with a couple of different options that will work from a field design perspective. And probably each option will have a different cost associated with it. So that's where we've got to work with the city, of course, and figure out what we can do, how much it's going to cost, and then that will dictate timeline and how we move forward with cleanup. That's kind of all we had to present today. We reviewed the site history and talked a little bit about the regulatory overview. It's kind of complicated, and I ran through it with the timeline, but I guess the takeaway is we've done a lot in this past year. We've basically done, under a normal MCP site, mass contingency plan site, probably what would be 3.5 years worth of work. We've done that in 9 months. So it's very important that people understand that. We discussed why we're comfortable opening a portion of the playground. I think you could all see there's a lot of testing been done in that area, and we all feel pretty good about being able to open that area. We reviewed the data from the ball field in particular, and you saw where those high concentrations are, that we think there's something else going on there, and then we want to go in and evaluate prior to working through then the next steps for overall field cleanups and field development strategy. We think how we get to closure here is going to be some sort of combination of removal of some of that material. Some of it's very high concentrations and will need to be removed, combined with some sort of capping scenario. Now, how much gets removed, how much gets left, the elevations, none of that's been decided yet. And those are really the next steps. So with that, that's the update, and we'd love to hear some questions.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a bunch of them, so.
Sure.
Okay. First of all, I have a kid in the preschool that's right there, as well as kids that have been at Brooklyn Boulders and Arts and Crafts. So a huge thank you to the work you've done in the city to reopen the playground, because it was a huge issue. And this is my question, but we've actually lost students at the preschool because they can't send their kids to a program that didn't have a playground. So I just want to underscore how important it is that that was reopened. So a couple of my questions. So I'm a little unclear on why the southeast portion wasn't open. I know you kind of jumped over that. What were the concentrations there? And so I guess that's one question. And then should there be any concern about exposure that's happened for children that have been playing there for the last couple of years? Because there's a water feature there, so kids spend, the very little kids spend a lot of time right there licking the ground.
Okay, so Marie, do you want to come up and we'll talk together? We did look at the concentrations in that area, and I can't remember what the maximum numbers were, but they were nothing like what you see in the
Yeah,
ball field. Do you want to?
The maximum concentration in that area was 5
PCBs.
for
Yes,
PCBs.
yeah.
And that was kind of an outlier. Almost all of them were a fair bit lower than that. And so I evaluated the playground, assuming little kids would be there, as well as children from age 1 to 30 would be there. So I did like a very short-term exposure, then I did a kind of a medium-range exposure and a long-term exposure. All of those passed. When I say they passed, I mean that there was no significant risk associated, no significant health risk associated with being exposed to the PCBs that were in the playground area. And I did that even using the maximum concentration.
But to answer your question, so we looked at the data, and strictly from a data risk management, we thought maybe you could open the southeastern portion. The concentrations in general are pretty low. However, there's a perception, and we don't and can't sample every square inch of that. So you have to be a little conservative in the assumptions. So collectively, we decided that while we don't feel there's a big risk, there's an uncertainty. So the collective opinion was, let's keep that area closed. You mentioned the concrete pad. I don't think we sampled there, but we did sample some of the other concrete in other areas, and we did not find any PCBs in concrete.
Right. They were all non-detect.
Yeah.
Can I keep going, or do you have
Keep going.
questions? Okay. The red areas
Yeah.
on the field, what kind of material was that in? Was that in the fill? And what was the fill?
So the fill is a little bit of everything. It's historic granular fill. It's primarily soil. I don't think we saw a lot of brick and glass and building debris that we've seen on other sites. It's just, where it came from, we're not sure. We're working with the city, looking at past documents to see if we can understand where it came from. But I don't want to speculate on that. It's classic urban historic fill. I know that may not answer your question, but it's...
And then, I'm not that familiar with the MCP, so can land use controls be used to be protective of human health? Like meaning, you need construction support, but otherwise at the surface, just top 2 feet need to be clear and you're fine? Or do you really need to remediate down to 7 feet?
That's going to be the discussions and evaluation that we're going to do. So part of that is looking at the overall risk. Also, when you're dealing with PCBs, because there's 2 tracks. There's the mass contingency plan requirements and what TSCA requires, and they have different requirements. I think for sure some of the red areas have got to come out. Even though they're at depth, I can't imagine EPA saying, yeah, you can leave those in place. But we recognize that when you're dealing with this material, there's a cost. So that's going to be the challenge as we go forward. Do you want to add something to that? Oh, good.
No, I think that's good.
And yes, you can use land use restrictions, activity and use limitations, they call them Massachusetts, to limit or to recognize that you're leaving contamination in place and put in certain requirements for future use so that people know, okay, if I have to put a utility through here, or at some point this field may have a scoreboard or light poles and we're generating soil, that it's documented that it's there and how it gets managed.
One last question.
Sure.
The different geophysical equipment can see to different depths. So, and I can't recall the depth ranges, but the EM and the GPR that you're going to use, I'm assuming it's confirmed that it can actually see to the depths of the deepest red that you're looking at?
That's right. Yeah, we'll talk with our sub and explain what we're trying to do. We've used both types of equipment, and you usually use both because you're absolutely right. They have slightly different responses, and one's better at looking deeper, one has more definition, but may not look as deep. So yeah, we're going to talk to this, make sure the sub understands what our goals are, and that will likely be the combination that we use. We've used those before. Yes. I think the lady behind you had a question. Yeah.
I couldn't see the diagram super clearly for the timeline. It seemed like it can take up to 5 years, it seems like, to actually open the park. And what you're saying is that Conway, the ball field may not actually be open for up to 5 years, or are you trying to say that you're actually moving through that plan a little bit faster?
Yeah, I'm not saying we're going to take 5 years. What I was saying is the regulations under the mass contingency plan have a prescribed timeline that that you have to meet, but you can always clean up sites quicker. DPs here and there will say, we want you to clean up sites quicker. And our goal is absolutely to move faster, but I wanted people to understand that it's a process. You have to understand what's there. Then you really have to know nature and extent, really know what's there, not just what you thought was there. And it takes time. And so the mass contingency plan allows those milestones. What I also want to say is that, you know, we've heard some frustration that, you know, the city may not be moving quickly on this, but we've done a lot. We collected 700 samples. We've done a lot in the time we had. And we're probably 3 years into a normal cleanup we've done in 9 months. So in that assessment process.
Oh, it's definitely amazing work. I actually moved here in February, and the park was one of the big reasons to move into the area.
Right.
So when it closed within a few weeks, was one of the reasons.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to get an understanding of like, what would be a good expectation? Imagining no obstacle for the soonest of the park. I know it's not a commitment. Just is that 2 years out? Is that?
So that's a challenge to answer that question, because we've got to go through this next phase of a little bit more assessment and come up with a remedial plan. Part of that it's going to require a couple of things. It's going to require commitment from the city for funding, how they're going to fund the cleanup. It's going to require, you know, possible discussions with the city on, are there other funding sources out there that might be able to help? There's a design bid process that has to be followed. And we also are going to need approval from EPA on the cleanup plan, which usually takes some time. So I'm not dodging your question on the time, but there are a bunch of things that have to happen, and I certainly don't want to speak for the city on that. I don't know if Anne or Emily wants to.
The only point I'd like to just reiterate pretty much what George said, and that is this is an incredibly complex site. There is so much data here to understand, and we don't want to promise or suggest that it'll be done within a certain time frame. The most important thing is health and safety, and we want to have a very real understanding of that data before we make any estimates whatsoever. At this point, we need to get more data. We need to have a better understanding of, you know, some corners of the ball field and to understand what's happening there. When we have that, we should be able to at least, we'll have a better idea of what the next steps are.
May I ask one more question? It's regarding, so a lot of the information presented here, is that also going to be available on the internet, or like?
So it will be. We put the word draft in there for a reason, because as we were pulling together for this meeting, and you know, we found a couple of places where a couple of the data points we needed to check. For example, when we sample, you do a duplicate sample, and we found one area where the dupe didn't quite match. So we want to check with the lab. So that's why I'm not ready to say, yes, this is final. But our goal is it's pretty much what it is, what we presented today. We'll be finalizing that probably by the end of the year, and then that will become a final document. We will be submitting that first report that we're required under the mass contingency plan by March 29th, actually. So if you hadn't seen the data, you would absolutely see it in that submittal. but the goal is, you know, what we presented tonight will be, I think, uploaded to the city's website, not immediately, but once we've truthed out a couple of those data points, so shortly. So you had a question?
I was going to ask just for you, I think you gone over the short-term timeline, but for a long-term timeline. But the one thing that I'm trying to figure out in my head is you said you have 5 years from March 29th of this year to get the whole project completed, correct?
That's.
And you said you're about 3.5 years, the work you've done in 9 months typically takes about 3.5 years, which would then imply that you have only got about 18 months of work left.
You could take that opinion, sure.
But you could also say you still have 4 years and a quarter to go of time. And that's,
What I'm trying to say is we've done a lot in that first year. 700 samples far exceeds a typical first year level of effort. That's really the point I was trying to make. The next steps really are going to be dictated by the design of the field, getting the funding all aligned, and how we can remediate the site and
Right.
how much we need to take out.
And getting approval from DEP and EPA.
Yeah.
so if the city decides which surface it wants to put on, will that affect the timeline?
I don't know. I don't want to get into design elements here. I know I know where you're going with that question.
Well, I'm just curious. I don't know if one would accelerate it or not. I have no idea.
I think part of what we're going to look at in the next couple of months is those options, right? Soil, do we remove soil? Do we need to stay at this grade? You know, that's a really important question, because we know we have the retaining wall issue to deal with. You also got an active railroad at the back. Can you raise grade at the site, do that that meets the aesthetics, but also maintains, you know, how the park looks, whether those retaining walls work? Can we do that? I actually don't know that. We just really got the green light to start looking into that. So that's what I was saying about the remedial plan. We want a remediation-informed design, but the plan's really got to work from a field's perspective as well. It's got to meet the programming. It's, you know, it's going to meet ADA. It's got to meet a lot of things. So part of our scope does include having a conceptual design with landscape architects looking at the fields piece of this, so that whatever we plan, you know. Now, if your question was, once we decide, I don't know yet what will be a faster procurement, faster approvals. That's something that will unfold in the next month or two.
So the remedial planning and conceptual design, how long will that process take to project?
I project next couple of months, you know, into February probably. That's the goal. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
So I'm sorry, I didn't get your name, sir.
George Naslis.
George Nassas. And you're the LSP on this project?
I am.
Are you an independent contractor or you were employed by Weston Sampson?
No, I work for Weston and Sampson.
All right. So was Weston Sampson contractor for the original geotech study?
Yes, we were.
And did you conduct that study?
No, I'm not a geotechnical engineer.
All right. So you weren't involved in the first phase?
No, I was. I was part of the planning for that first phase.
So you were part of the planning that, in addition to doing the geotech evaluation that was required for testing that retaining wall, decided to go ahead and sample the rest of the site?
So that was a discussion we had with the city at the time. And we all understood that if you detect something in soil, this is a very common question we get about whether to test or not to test. We all understood that it might precipitate actions down the road. So it was a question that came up, and we collectively decided that we, certainly if we were going to repair that wall and needed to export soil, we needed to know the quality behind the soil. And secondly, we knew that looking ahead, there was going to be some field renovation. So the real money, the big money is in construction. It's not in design. And the last thing you want to do is be in a project and have your contractor go, up. I can't do this. This is a change order. So we went in with our eyes open collectively that we needed to do some testing to kind of understand what we might be in for down the road. Does that answer your question?
Let's presume that I'm an engineer and an elected official trying to ask very specific questions.
Yeah.
The testing that was done for that original geotech survey, the scope of testing of soil that was done was beyond that which was necessary for a geotech evaluation for the repair of that retaining wall, correct?
We had a couple of elements to that original scope. There was a the geotesting, the structural survey, and we did some environmental testing as well. The geotech, sorry.
And that environmental testing, you are at the direction, as a contractor of the city, you're at the direction of the city as to how much testing to do.
Yes.
So that decision to test the entirety of the site was a decision of the city.
It was a collective decision, yes. We talked about where we should look. That's correct. So it was an initial look. It wasn't a complete characterization of the whole area. Right. It was just an initial look with a focus nearer the wall area because we knew we needed to understand what was there.
I didn't see any maps of the original test site. I believe there were some differences in colors in the dots when the playground site, which borings were part of the original samples and which borings were not. Was there a map of the full playground or the ball field, which is where the retaining wall exists?
This figure,
and which ones were initial testing and which ones were follow-up testing?
Yes.
Okay, I'm glad to take a look at that in a second.
Sure.
So this site has been declared as an MCP site and as a TSCA EPA site. That declaration occurred on March 29th.
That's when it was formally reported to DEP. We had discussed it with them verbally and with EPA prior to that.
I guess, so the tier classification is due on March 29th. Has that tier classification happened yet? It sounds like, since you are still maintaining this as a draft document, that you have not finalized it and done a tier classification yet?
No, that will be sent in by March 29th, 2019. That's a separate report to what we have, to what we're preparing right now.
You have an anticipated tier classification?
No, I haven't looked at that.
Okay. I do have, I guess, one last question with regard to the PCB contamination level. You referred to 50 as a concentration, I believe 50 milligrams per kilogram, as a regulatory cutoff. When you say that, can you elaborate on what you mean exactly? What regulation that's triggering?
Sure, and I'll defer to Prasanta, who's going to help me out here. There's really a TSCA limit. TSCA is the Toxic Substance Control Act. So they use 50 as one of their cutoffs. So that's why we've worked on sites where they can leave material below 50 on certain sites. Is that correct?
In general, if you have greater than 50 ppm, EPA will tell you to remove it. So EPA tells you what to do. And that's the reason we have been talking to EPA as well as DEP.
So, can I just add one thing? Prasanta, I believe that when the concentrations in the soil are above 50, that TSCA requires a different disposal facility rather than, so it has to go to a stricter disposal location rather than if it's below 50.
Absolutely right.
And that has cost implications.
Right.
When the concentrations are less than 50, sometimes removal is the remediation required. Sometimes there are alternative remediation methods, correct?
Yes.
You use of those remediation methods, is that in this case going to be dictated by EPA or by Mass DEP, or is it going to be dependent on the surface treatment, surface use in the future?
I think it's going to be EPA as well as DEP.
Is that going to be dependent upon the future usage of the site?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And final question, in terms of thresholds, I believe I heard that there was one site that was 5 milligrams per kilogram in that southeast corner section, correct?
One sample in the playground area.
In the
That
southeast
was-
corner of the playground area.
Yes, that was the highest concentration throughout the whole playground area.
I believe I heard you characterize that as an outlier?
For the playground area.
Yeah.
The playground area had much lower concentrations of PCBs, and then this one higher concentration.
Thank you. At what depth was that sample?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay. And given that those samples in the playground area were also full stack samples, presumably, that went down to,
Yes.
I can't recall the chart, was it 20 feet?
Not that
No,
deep.
not that deep, but we,
More like 10 feet.
in the playground,
Those are shallow.
yeah.
Yeah, the playground were a little shallower because the fill didn't go as much.
So how many samples total were there in that southeast area of the playground? You can certainly go back a few slides and count dots if need be.
Yeah, it was something in the neighborhood of 20.
20 up.
Okay. So 1 out of 20, and you said that the rest of the samples in that area were significantly less.
Yes.
Could you characterize for me what that means? Is that less than 1 on all other samples?
There were maybe 2 samples that were around 2 parts per million, and then most of the other ones were 1 or less. And in the area that we opened, there were, I think every single sample was less than 1, which is a standard that DEP has.
Most were non-detect.
And most were non-detect.
So for DEP, I guess this is maybe a question for the DEP representatives in the room?
That's been there.
Sure. Sir, for concentrations of 2, when there are 3 samples out of 20 that are above 1, which is kind of a negligible level, does that merit your intervention in terms of determination of how the site is used at that point?
So if they're above 1 in terms of the concentration of PCBs, 1 milligram per kilogram, they need to report it to us. But we look at risk to the public, and in this case it would be children, based upon an average concentration. And that's with the understanding that a child is not going to be exposed and play in just one spot and that be its exposure concentration. So if whatever that exposure area is, and I agree with Marie that it would be the entire 20 samples plus or minus whatever the number was, then you can average those concentrations and look at what the end result is and determine whether that would represent a significant, this term significant risk is a regulatory term that dictates whether you need to do cleanup or whether it's okay as is.
Yeah. What I heard from Weston Sampson was that based on that study they did not, to a regulatory threshold, determine that there was significant risk. So the decision to close this is really not something that's being mandated by Mass DEP, nor by the licensed site professional, sir. Is it your professional opinion as a licensed site professional that that portion of the playground must continue to remain closed?
We discussed that with DP and EPA, and actually, I think Kim Tisa wanted it to stay closed. I can't remember that phone call exactly, but she was on the call, and I thought I'd said she wanted it closed.
Well, I'll speak for DEP. I don't want to speak for the EPA agency, but for our standpoint, if it's not essential to be open, okay, then we would prefer to have enough testing get done. Now, more testing was done after the initial closure, okay? And so to us, if we can avoid exposure, rather than do a risk assessment and average concentrations, if things can be tested enough and then a remedial approach come up with so that there is no exposure to us, that would be preferable than to average things and rely on risk assessments. So I'm in favor of having that portion of the playground closed off until remedial options can be looked at, and I believe that there will be an option that will be able to either cover or, remove a shallow amount of the soil in order to eliminate exposure for children there. And that to me is preferable than relying on risk assessments.
Can I just add to that? There was, in all of this is uncertainty, right? So you don't have data from every single square centimeter of the area. So I think one of the questions was, so you have 5 here, you've got 2 there, then you've got non-detects. We were just being conservative with that collective discussion because you got children playing there. So we felt it was the right thing to do.
I heard you refer to collectively we decided, collectively we discussed. When you say collectively, are you referring to yourself as a licensed site professional, Weston Sampson, Mass DEP, and EPA, or are there other parties involved in the discussion?
Well, we work with the city, we work for the city, so we always discuss what we're doing at this particular site. It's very complicated with the city at all steps.
And the final question I guess I had is that you referred to remediation plan design being somewhere around February, having looked at different options for remediation plan and then coming forward with a recommendation in February. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's the goal. The goal is to develop a couple of options, look at costs that go with the options, look at the risk that goes with each of those options, have some design element in there that makes sense, again, so that we're not designing a remediation absent any fields. The goal's February, that's right.
And the different remediation options that would be available would be significantly different depending on what future plans there were for those areas of the site.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair comment, sure.
So, in effect, the choice of the remediation plan will constrain the future design conversations around this site?
We know the goal. The goal's to have a field for programming for soccer and other things. Okay. That's what we're hearing that the goal is. So we're hearing that it's going to be maintained as some sort of open space, right? Some sort of field for the city. So that's what we understand the goal to be. So we'll be thinking through options that get us to that endpoint. If I'm hearing it's a parking lot, then that might be different.
Right. I believe the rest of my questions can be directed to legal. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm just a citizen, no children. Are you dealing with EPA Region 1, or does this kind of stuff go down to our TPA?
So we are currently with Region 1. If, as we developed our cleanup plan, it may get bumped down to Washington for review. It may stay in the region, we don't know.
Okay. But it wouldn't go to science headquarters? I mean, PCBs are pretty common, so I just, but I know some of the real expertise is down in North Carolina.
I worked on at least 20 projects.
Yeah.
And only one project went to Washington, D.C., so it's likely that it will stay in Boston.
Yeah, just curious, I didn't know. So I don't know that much about PCBs, but I assume there's a range of PCBs here. And is there fate and transport the same? Or there are kind of classes that have different fate and transport in the soil?
So in general, PCBs tend to stick to soil, adsorb to soil. Generally, they don't. We've got some groundwater data from the four corners, and we haven't seen any in groundwater. But as I said, we have those big red blobs in one corner, so we need to know, is there something there?
Yeah, and about those two blobs, are the characteristics of the two the same? So that there would be lead to believe there's just one source and, they ended up in the two blobs, or?
Same outflow, right?
They were the same arrow.
Okay, okay. And then a completely different question.
Okay.
Okay. The state is under a legal obligation to not preclude the Green Line expanding down that rail corridor next to the commuter rail to Porter Square.
Okay.
And I don't know how close the boundary of this area is to that rail corridor, which might double in size.
Okay.
So have you thought about that?
Nope. Thanks for bringing it to our attention.
I mean, I just bring, it's not really what you're doing, but if there was eventually a little light rail corridor extended through that pre-existing light rail system extended to Porter with a couple stations, minor stations on the Somerville-Cambridge border, that could be really valuable to both communities and not much cost. So I just wanted to kind of throw that on in the back of your minds, okay?
So, yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think the boundaries of the field where it abuts the railroad, where it meets the ice rink parking lot, where we enter to from Somerville Ave, those are really important. That's why I was saying at the cleanup, we have a landscape architect doing some conceptual work with us, so that we can do something that's doable, compliant. But that area at the back, I don't know. I mean, we're not going to go beyond the property line for sure.
Right, but see, they're under a legal obligation to not preclude that, but you're not part of that legal obligation at this point, and somebody else who inadvertently made that corridor too narrow would not be a breach on their part, but it would be something you would not want to inadvertently do.
So that's maybe part of the conversation as we move forward.
Yeah, and I'm sure the city can help you with that. The city may not have been thinking about that, but, okay.
We try and anticipate, any future. Could be an infrastructure project, could be a utility. That's part of the conversation is for field design, what utilities are needed, electrical, where does that go? So I have to think through all of that.
I mean, often the rail corridors are pretty generous.
Sure.
Very hard to take any square feet away without a lot of process. But if there were a few extra square feet needed on the edges, for example, the main Green Line extension corridor up to Tufts, that's being widened quite a bit. Not necessarily expanding the legal right-of-way, which I don't know, because they might have owned the hillsides, but the hillsides are definitely being carved out to enable that extension. Okay? Thanks. Thanks very much.
Have you selected a landscape architect firm yet?
So we're not in full design. Weston Sampson has a LA practice, landscape architecture practice. So for the conceptual design, we're doing that in-house. The design has not been, we're not doing it.
Question about the southeast side. Is there the opportunity of the playground? Is there the opportunity that is going to be addressed separately from the ballpark, the same way the other part of the playground was kind of detached from the rest of the process, such that you can evaluate that on a different track than the rest of the ball field? And part of my interest is that area becomes more significant to community usage as late spring rolls around. And if there's an easier way to fix that as opposed to dealing with the red blob, since as you noted, the concentrations there are lower, and it may be easier to, the uncertainty remains, but it might be easier to address. I'm just wondering if that's a possibility.
I'd say all things are on the table with regards to that area. So I can't say it's going to be open sooner, but as we go through that process, you know, that's something that we understand the desire to open that area too.
And I think for the city to hear that that's a real priority.
I'd like to also amplify your voice there. That water feature is essential. It has enormous impact to families in that neighborhood, to the community as a whole. It is the closest water feature for quite some distance. My concern is that even though we've heard that there's no legal requirement to keep that closed, that the collective decision was made there, my concern is that is largely to just allow a construction pathway through, rather than allow families to actually use that water feature. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that consideration of the residents here will lead the city to reopen it. That's not a question for Weston and Sampson. I think that is an administration decision.
I think the city wants to look, the playground is clearly a priority for the city, and it has been. That was why we had that as a two-pronged approach. So we were initially looking at the entire site, and then we realized that the playground was a priority for the community, and we asked Weston Sampson to have a two-pronged approach to the site. And I think that has worked very well so far. As we've said, it's a complicated site. The playground has its own issues, and so as we determine the way to move forward with the playground and the field, there's a number of factors. Certainly, we don't want to slow down the process at all. We don't want to, and community health is again, number one. So the question is, like, we don't know the scope of that remediation at the playground. We don't know what impacts that will have. So there's a number of things which we still have to figure out before we can make the decision about how we move forward at the playground and the field. Does it stay as a two-pronged approach, or do we keep it as within a single scope of work?
As a follow-up, is there the possibility of doing just a quick hotspot removal? I mean, it sounds like on that part of the playground, it's really one sample that's at 5 and then 2 others that are at 2 with a couple scoops. I'm used to like IRMs, I don't know if that's part of the process.
We discussed, can we do a couple of scoops? It's not always as easy as a couple of scoops, but we have talked about that. Got to protect trees, right? So that's an issue. But yeah, we have talked about that. It just felt that when we were first discussing that, you got a bigger issue in the ball field to deal with. So do you want to spend money and then re-spend money, or do you do it as one project? Yeah, I had not heard about access to the rear, but just the logistics of that site. Yes, it's got to get through somehow. I had not heard though anyone ever say to us, we need that to get through to the rear of the field. That has not come up in any conversations that we've had. But as in any project, those logistics and planning are really, really important. We all want to minimize any disruption. So that's something we'll be thinking through.
Folks, it's 8 o'clock. We're happy to stay here for as long as anybody has questions. But does anybody have any more questions? We'd be happy to discuss them. As we've said, this meeting is being recorded, and it will be posted on the city website. We will take the responses to your questions and questions which we received by email, and we will incorporate them into the FAQs, the frequently asked questions that are on the website. This presentation will be there, and we encourage you to check that and to share with your friends. And then please, make sure you signed in on the email list. Do go to the website and go to the menu item where you can, put in your name for further communications. All right. thank you, everybody, for coming. I sincerely appreciate your interest in the project.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, guys.